everybody. Welcome to a special episode of Hammers and Dice. With me are Reed and John. Instead of doing our typical kind of talk about rules in the game, we're gonna do more of a lore-centric episode, with the coming of third edition being based around Istvaan 5, the Iron Warriors versus Salamanders in the box. We thought it'd be fun to do a deep dive into what actually happened on Istvaan 5. And we're kind of breaking it down into three parts. We're going to do kind of like the setup, like the leading up to it, and what got the Imperium to that point that Isstvan 5 would happen. Then obviously the battle itself and the aftermath of the battle and how things progressed from there. So before I dive in, I'm going to be taking the first part. But before I dive in, one thing I wanted to mention is with lore from GW is coming from a lot of different sources, and a lot of them don't always say the same thing. Even in like the Horus Heresy, the book series, they will sometimes change things from book to book because it's different authors. Even the number of Marines who fought in the battle has changed. There's one source that said that there were like 30,000 loyalists and 40,000 heretics. And then a few years later, they're like, actually, like the entire legion for the Salamanders and the Raven Guard were there, which would exceed 200,000. So a much bigger number than 30 to 40,000. So just keep that in mind as we go through. There might be things here that are different from what you've heard, and that's okay. That's part of the lore here. It all can get retconned or not. You never know.
And might be imminently retcon, like you mentioned, Randy, with the Isfun Arcana Journal kind of coming out soon.
Yeah, whatever's in that's going to be the new canon, so it might
Yeah,
completely
exactly.
change.
I think we can all agree though that it is towards the latter half of the Legion estimate numbers that are coming in. So the original numbers were kind of before they had solidified everything for Heresy,
Yeah.
and kind of the newer numbers are kind of considered what are that's what we've kind of been basing our
Yeah.
ideas off
So
of.
we're basing our stuff on the newest stuff we could find.
You're still shockingly low for, a 7 year galactic conflict. But
Yeah.
that's a different episode.
All right, so yeah, I'll dive in. So Isstvan 5 was the first major engagement between the heretics and like the actual loyalists, like the loyalist legions. And to get to that point, a lot of things had to happen. So the traitor legions, when they decided that they were going to betray the emperor, obviously they still had a lot of loyalist space marines in their ranks. So they had to figure out a way to purge them without everyone knowing, oh, hey, why did half this legion just kill half its space marines? It's a pretty big red flag. So Horus orchestrated Isstvan 3, which we're not going to get into the entire thing because that's a whole episode in of itself. But basically, the Emperor's Children, Death Guard, World Eaters, and Sons of Horus concocted this plot to send all of the loyalists from their legions to Isstvan 3 under the false narrative that they were putting down a rebellion, and then they virus bombed the planet. Fortunately for the loyalists, Nathaniel Garro of the Death Guard was on this ship, the Eisenstein, and he was very close friends with Saul Tarvitz and Garviel Loken, and they communicated to him that there was some heresy happening, and so he managed to escape. And that's actually like a whole book of and of itself, The Flight of the Eisenstein, where he just barely manages to get out of the Isstvan system. He's like attacked by all these warp storms. There's like demons coming after him. And this is the first time that we're seeing that the traitors are aligned with these demonic forces. It's not just people being like, hey, I'm going to rebel. It's people who have been corrupted by the warp and by the chaos gods who are like actively trying to stop him from getting back to Terra. And this all comes to a head when he is saved by Rogal Dorn, who himself is on his way back to Terra. And he tells Dorn what happened, and Dorn is pretty fucking pissed. He like nearly kills him because he doesn't believe him at first. And then that was when Euphrates Keeler basically comes in and manages to convince Dorn what happened because she shows him the pics of Horus and his legion like butchering people. So Dorn takes Garo back to Terra, and they kind of investigate what's going on. They're like, oh shit, like this is real. They betrayed us. Uh, Around the same time, Fulgrim had gone to Horus and was like, "Look, I can get Ferrus Manus on our side." Ferrus Manus and Fulgrim were like best friends, among a lot of the Primarchs, even though they're brothers, they don't necessarily like each other that much. There's a lot of sibling rivalry there, and some of them were friends, a lot of them weren't. But Ferrus and Fulgrim were really close friends. They had actually forged weapons for each other. Uh, and Fulgrim was convinced that if he was the one to talk to Ferrus Manus, he'd be able to convince him that the traitors were in the right and he would join them. So Horus gave him permission to go talk to Ferrus. It did not go well. They fought. Fulgrim actually almost killed Ferrus, but in the last minute spared his life because he couldn't bring himself to kill his brother. But then he fled with his troops, and so then Ferrus himself also knew that there was a rebellion happening. So a couple things didn't exactly go to plan for Horus in the opening stages. The Imperium found out sooner than he would have liked that he was rebelling. But he still held a lot of the cards because at this point in time, they only knew about those few legions, obviously the Sons of Horus, Emperor's Children, Death Guard, and World Eaters that were the traitors. They were operating in the assumption that it was just those legions who had done this. And at this point as well, shit has gone sideways with Magnus the Red. He had seen Horus's betrayal. He had attempted to warn the Emperor by traveling through the warp and breaking through his gateway, which also did not end well. Which meant that at this point in time, the Emperor was stuck on the Golden Throne. He couldn't really communicate. So it was kind of up to Dorn and Malcador to figure out this plan. And they were like, Ferris, you have seniority. You take all the legions you can gather, go to the Istvaan system, and kill Horus, basically. Bring the traitors to heel. And Ferris at this point was enraged. He had quite the temper among the Primarchs, and he was convinced that he would be able to rally all these legions to him, get there at full speed, surprise Horus, and basically kill him before he would be expected. Ferris made a lot of mistakes here. Uh, the first of them being very impatient and thinking he could just rush ahead and kill Horus really quickly. Because the Iron Hands were a very large legion. They're actually one of the largest, strongest legions. They had like a lot of ships. They had a lot of Mechanicum allies. But because of that, they were kind of a ponderous group. They couldn't move very quickly, and Ferris wasn't willing to wait for the majority of his legion to get together. So he took off with like his elites straight to Istvan, and the first legions to arrive that were ready were the Raven Guard with Corax and the Salamanders with Vulcan. So his plan was to have their three legions be the first wave and then be followed up by the next few legions to arrive, which were the Night Lords, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, and the Alpha Legion, which, assuming you know anything about the heresy, uh, doesn't really go well for them. But again, at this point, they have no idea that any of these legions are traitors. They are assuming that these are all loyalists who have been sent to help them. And this goes back to how, even though this wasn't necessarily how Horus wanted the things to go, he still had the upper hand here. He had managed to send a lot of the larger loyalist legions to the fringes of the galaxy, so they wouldn't be anywhere near Istvan when this happened. The Ultramarines were in Ultramar. They were preparing for what they thought was a large orc invasion, and they were going to be helped by the Word Bearers, which, obviously a trap. The Blood Angels were sent to Cygnus Prime by Horus, who convinced them that it would be a way to help cure the Black Rage that they had. The Dark Angels were sent to the fringes of the galaxy. The White Scars were sent to the fringes of the galaxy. So all of these legions were sent far away so that really only these few legions were able to react. And the Raven Guard and the Salamanders weren't really well equipped for this kind of warfare. These were more specialized, smaller legions. But before they got there, Horus had Fulgrim build a massive fortress on Isstvan 5, which Isstvan 5 was a dead world. It had once been inhabited by Xenos a long time ago, and all that had remained basically is black sand and like the shell of these Xenos, buildings. So Horus picked this place called the Urgal Depression on Isstvan 5, which was very defensible. Having built this fortress, it basically couldn't be like bombed. If the loyalists wanted to get them out, wanted to kill them, they had to basically commit to a surface invasion, which is exactly what Horus wanted. So at this point, the trap was set, and we will hand it off to Reed to talk about the actual massacre itself.
Yeah, so thank you, Randy, for the kind of the setup with all of that. So as the loyalists kind of entered into the Isfont system, they were quick to notice that the traitor fleet elements were missing at this point in time. So Isfont looked like a ripe target. So against the cautious counseling of Vulcan and the kind of tacit endorsement by Korax, Ferris Manus decides to go headway into it and say, kind of cowabunga it is, not even waiting for his for the remainder of his legion to show up, as Randy kind of pointed out. So, and really getting into the kind of the force kind of that we were seeing here. The loyalists for the Iron Hands were around 75K. The Salamanders were around 83K legionaries, and then the Raven Guard were around 80K. So it was putting it up there around 250,000 legionaries on the loyalist side, with the expectation of almost double that, if not more, when the next legions wave would arrive. The Legio Ataris, the Firebrands, had arrived with the loyalist fleet in an effort to be the only loyalist Titan Legion that would participate in this battle. Against that, though they had been bloodied at Isfahan 3, the traders were still in a very good spot. The Sons of Horus around 80,000, the Death Guard around 70,000, World Eaters around 78,000, and the Emperor's Children around 60. That would still put them around roughly even numbers, just at that, if not even favoring the traders. Let alone, let's also kind of be able to discuss that there was the Auxilia there for both sides, along with Mechanicum allies, which would make up kind of a smaller portion. The Mechanicum are rarely mentioned in the Isfahan 5 drop site because it's so heavily focused on the Legion. But there are small elements of them that are definitely mentioned in there. Something also to mention for the traders is a huge war asset for them on Isfahan 5 is a small Demi Legio of Mortis, Legio Mortis, along with the Dies Irae, one of the most powerful Titans that was ever created from the forges of Mars, let alone of the hands of mankind. So Horus really had his work stacked in the favor. So as the loyalists kind of come there and they decide that they're going to go headlong into the jaws of whatever trap there probably is, Ferris Manus ordered a drop pod assault with hundreds of drop pods raining onto the black sand, hundreds of storm birds, storm eagles, thunderhawks, every kind of imaginable lander following up behind. So to the left flank, the Salamanders deployed with the Iron Warriors taking the direct middle, with the Raven Guard taking the far right. The right was really made up of kind of jagged, broken rocks and kind of different formations that made it for asymmetrical warfare. This really benefited the Raven Guard's tactical style, while the Salamanders were able to deploy to the left with all of the trenches, which their flamers obviously made a killing in. Where it's talked about in the first moments of the drop, the loyalists making such a headlong rush for quite a while before they even encounter traitor resistance from their traitor legion counterparts. So if you can imagine, they're really just almost probably tearing through the Auxilia that Horus is left out in, basically no man's land, waiting to just receive and be a meat shield for his more important units. Obviously, I also wanted to kind of point out there was a small orbital bombardment before, but I'm going to come back to that later because I think that is a big portion of, as Randy mentioned, it wasn't going to ever be very effective. But the idea, there was just such a limited amount of it, it really didn't soften Isfahan 5's kind of defenses any further. So the Loyalists were going headlong into it. It was a brutal kind of one-on-one action. The Raven Guard mainly faced the Sons of Horus, who also benefited from the asymmetrical warfare. The Iron Hands obviously were taking the middle. They were the ones that were rushing headlong into trying to punch the traitors. They met up with the Emperor's Children, which obviously was the grudge match that we all know and love between those legions have just formed, and there's this kind of burning hatred as the Emperor's Children the Phoenix Guard had just massacred a large crop of the veterans of the Iron Hands. So this kind of fresh betrayal from one that they would see almost as one of their closest legions. It had just sparked a fury in the Iron Hands that had gone beyond rage into kind of cold madness, I would say. From there, the Salamanders were fighting the Death Guard. There's mention at this point that when the traitors seemed to be on the back foot and their lines were starting to bow, Angron and Mortarion were unleashed in their respective war zones, and the Primarchs obviously were at the forefront of the fighting for all the legions that were deployed. Save for Horus. I think he is the real standout in there that he never took to the field in this one. Another thing to kind of to flag for everyone, there was a really awesome tank battle that occurred. This is one of the few tank battles that we kind of really get some kind of description of the Salamanders, Land Raiders, and Spartans actually kind of ping off enough of the DSE array that it has to retreat out of the battlefield, which was a huge win for the Loyalists at this time. Because as we know, the DSE array is just so massively packed with weaponry. The idea of that thing just being able to stand on top of the Argyle Depression and fire down would be devastating to the incoming Loyalist assaulters. For the first time since the signing of the Pact of in the Peace of Mars and the formation of the Mechanicum, Titans dueled each other, with the Legio Itaris going against the Legio Mortis. And between the two of them, along with their legion support for the tank companies of the Salamanders and the Iron Hands versus the Sons of Horus and the World Eaters, both of them almost kind of neutralized each other. And really, this was a kind of a cataclysmic moment, but it really it took the pressure off of the flanks of the Loyalists, allowing them to continue their assault on the Argyle Depression. It mentions attack crafts that were coming and unloading their payloads of troops and tanks, and then immediately going on suicidal runs, just trying to deal enough damage that maybe their one kind of missile that they launch out and destroy this one emplacement is the thing that will tip the balance. That's what every pilot was thinking at this time. So you can imagine the fury that was happening in the skies. It also mentions that after all the Legion was deployed, the Imperial Auxilio was deployed, and how clustered it was at this point in time, that almost the log jam it mentions of wrecked bodies and just tanks and debris that were littering the battlefield had made it almost at a point where there was no movement available for the Loyalists. About 3 hours into the fighting, there was a break that was kind of assumed about to happen. Vulcan and Corax had seen the landers of their Loyalist legions coming in, the Iron Warriors, the Word Bearers, the Alpha Legion, and the Night Lords. All of them had landed and started setting up their own deployments. The Iron Warriors, in specific, were setting up behind the Imperial Militia with their own fortifications. And it actually kind of calls back to history in some points with the kind of double envelopment of an enemy, and the idea of boxing it in between two fortifications. It kind of reminds like of the Siege of Alesia. There's these really awesome points in history where convalescing fortifications are made up to entrap an enemy, and it just makes this killing field that you can imagine. With that, though, of course, the flare goes up from the War Master's fortress, and with that, the massacre begins in earnest. The Salamanders have been retreating, and they are even getting close enough to see some of the Iron Warriors and Alpha Legion, while the Word Bearers are even hailed by name by some of the Raven Guard before the guns of 100,000 bolters open up and scythe down the Loyalists. Who also, once again, at this time, were mainly the fighting wounded. Most people were wounded at this point in time, let alone with all their ammo spent and their weapons broken. It was a total rout at this point in time. Some things to really mention, though, and flag this was the first time that the Gout Warback were actually unleashed and kind of shown off in a significant way. It was actually a terrible point where Corax fights Lorgar and is about to kill him before Kurz steps in and saves him. This prompts Corax to flee, and in doing so, Kurz looks down and kind of tells Lorgar how disgusted he is about what he sees, the degradation of his legion. It's this really, really interesting moment of like, why would Kurz try to help kind of one of his weaker brothers because he seems to be kind of the type that might not, typically do that. The kind of star of the show, though, was the fight between Ferris Manus and Fulgrim. So right before the massacre occurred, uh, Vulcan and Korax were calling to Ferris in time to tell him to, to retreat, like let our brothers come down and be the second wave that have now come to continue breaking the fortress. But Ferris is unwilling to hear this. His rage is so overwhelming that and in this moment, it's assumed that he sees Fulgrim for the first time and kind of just goes into a blood mad rage and just fights his way to it. And bear in mind, at this point in time, Forgebreaker has been taken by Fulgrim when Fulgrim tried to recruit Ferris Manus many months ago. Ferris Manus is running through the battlefield, assumed with his bare hands, tearing legionaries apart and just trying to punch and scrap his way to fight Fulgrim. It's assumed at this point in time that once again Fulgrim was able to get the upper hand, and there's kind of differing depictions of like, does Ferris have his hammer at that point in time? There's one image with him with a wrench, I think, let alone or with his hands. So you can imagine what it is. But Fulgrim, being the expert duelist he is, with the blade, the lair blade that he had succumbed to so long ago, he now used this to fight and kill and decapitate Ferris Manus. With this, it was a total kind of implosion of the loyalist ranks. The Iron Hands were just resigned to kind of the bitter despair, and kind of fighting to die along with their Primarch. The Salamanders went in kind of a frenzied suicidal rage, in that Vulcan was so upset that the betrayal had happened, he basically summoned his legion to him, and they just decided to push into the traitors and deal as many casualties as they could. While the Raven Guard, on the other hand, decided that it was time to try to extricate themselves. And so a fighting retreat began, with them trying to break out of the Erval depression. The battle was really capped, though, at the end, with the Salamanders being kind of overrun and Perturabo unleashing atomic weaponry upon the Salamanders, destroying all of them besides Vulcan, who is obviously the perpetual that we learned for the first time at this moment, and his inability to be killed. There's statistics out there, and John will probably get into this as well, about the idea of how many escape, but obviously the massacre is fairly total. It goes down in Imperial records as one of the most bitter defeats that was ever occurred. And it really set the stage for what would come in the latter years. So, John, if you don't mind, take it away and tell us about the aftermath.
When the second wave arrives, we see, the word bearers, the Salamander, word bearers, Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, and Night Lord's fleet arrive. And then just as the betrayal happens on the ground, we see a space battle happens. The traitor fleet, the second wave, engages the loyalist fleet. And initially it's kind of like a regular space battle, but when the traitor fleet arrives, the Sons of Horus, Empress Children, Death Guard, and World Leaders fleet arrives, then it's a massacre in space for the loyalists. We see the loss of two Gloriana class battleships. I think what the Iron Hands and the Salamanders, no, so the Salamanders and the Raven Guard lose some of the capital ships in the battle, which is again a huge blow to the loyalists. And on top of that, in terms of the Primarch losses, Vulcan is presumed dead, even though, as readers, we know he's a perpetual. The main characters don't, so they assume he has been slain. So the loyalists are operating on this idea that two loyalist Primarchs have been lost. Even Korax, Dorn doesn't know that he survived. As far as Dorn knows, Korax is gone, even though he's actually waging a guerrilla war against the World Eaters and Word Bearers still on the planet. But yeah, it's a huge loss to loyalists. I mean, it's a clear strategic victory for Horus, right? His main goal of crippling the loyalist legions was fulfilled. You have the Salamanders, Raven Guard, and Iron Hands all but reduced to almost nothing. I mean, we see the formation of Shattered Legions with them. So they still do stuff in the heresy, but in terms of them as like a legion, a cohesive fighting force that could stand against Horus, they're pretty much done for the rest of the heresy. Ferris is dead, right? Horus gets his severed head, and he gets some really funny Macbeth-style soliloquies where he talks to Ferris every once in a while, wishing he had Ferris instead of like Angron or something. But yeah, it's kind of just Primarch's dead, and I think that's one of the biggest things about the battle, regardless of I mean, legions being destroyed are one thing, but a Primarch, as far as we know, for the first time, not counting Magnus, has been slain. One of the Emperor's sons has been slain by his brother. So that's a huge blow to the Loyalists. In terms of the other legions, we see the kind of like the setup for how they are for the rest of the heresy. Going back to the loyalists, we see a 98% casualty rate for, see their notes here, for the salamanders. They go down
Yeah.
to a little under 2,000 space marines from the tens of thousands that they were. Not a cohesive fighting force. Raven Guard have around 2,000 marines left. Now, not all the Iron Hands are there, and I think with the advent of 2.0, I noticed this shift in the lore where it's always like, well, not everyone was there. So, there's still kind of scattered elements of these legions out in the galaxy, but again, as a cohesive fighting force, you don't really see Vulcan calling the Salamanders together or Corax calling the Raven Guard together at this point. You see the formation of the Shattered Legions, where bands of these decimated loyalists come together to do harrying guerrilla actions against the traitors, or maybe join bigger loyalist forces. We see elements of the Salamanders and Iron Hands at the Guilliman's Unremembered Empire and Imperium Secundus. We see some of them at Terra even for the final battle, but yeah, they're pretty much destroyed. And in terms of the traitors, right after the battle, we see the first kind of appearances of chaos cult activity. You have the Dark Mech, the Word Bearers, Emperor's Children, just performing malefic rites with the corpses of the loyalists, torturing prisoners, and all that, kind of hinting at the future of the traitor legions as now they're turning into actual Chaos Space Marines. The Raven Guard actually hang up for a bit at Isfahan. The ones that don't escape initially wage a guerrilla campaign with the traitors are still there. We kind of see these cool battles where the World Eaters or the Word Bearers are building these kind of temples to the Chaos Gods, and then the Raven Guard come in like blow them up. So it's a kind of a cool like kill team esque actions there. But even though this is happening, the traitors just leave. They've accomplished their objective. They've just decimated the loyalists, and they're going according to Horus's plans. You see the Word Bearers and the World Eaters as a whole kind of going to the Ultramar sector because Calth is about to happen at this point, and after that we see the Shadow Crusade. So Horus sends the Word Bearers and the World Eaters to fight the Ultramarines in Ultramar and kind of create the Ruin Storm. The Night Lords are sent to the Thramas sector to kind of pin down the Dark Angels. At this point, Horus is free to go to Molech to try to steal the Emperor's power. We also see at the beginning of what's the word of this dissolution in command structure with the traitors, because Horus has these objectives for his brothers, but a lot of them just side quests, like Fulgrim's famous side quest to be a demon primarch, right? We see that starts to happen. But yeah, this is kind of the opening gambit to the heresy. This is the big thing where loyalist legions get the loyalist force. The loyalist cause as a whole suffers a big blow with the loss of three loyalist legions and the loss of the four other legions to Horus. Now half the legions are not loyalist, right? I didn't say for Horus, because Thousand Sons are still up in the game at this point, but yeah, Doran is probably not very happy that this whole thing just occurred. Guilliman's doesn't know what's going on until Calth happens. Say, the Khan has this whole thing where he doesn't know who's actually loyalist, who's actually traitor. So Horus is has a huge advantage here, and we see the opening of the heresy where Space Marines kill Space Marines from different legions.
And now, kind of going off of what you just mentioned, John, we've now seen this trailer where Malthador goes to talk to Valdor afterwards, and Valdor, for the kind of, I think, for the first time, realizes really what they're getting into. He mentions this idea of like a war unending that's about to come.
Yeah.
And even though Valdor, he has the Apollonian spear and learns so much from what he kills, his ability to learn increases every time he kills. You could imagine even at this point in time, though, he still is so far away from knowing what he knows by like the end of the siege and the idea of the spoiler and maybe what is to come. Uh, Valdor at this moment has that really sage point of like this is war eternal almost now. This is what it will shatter the dream that we built.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting. I think it's really cool. Even today we're as of yesterday we're getting new lore blurbs basically of how these
Yeah.
characters are interacting and reacting to the idea that the massacre has occurred, and the loyalists are really on the back foot.
And I think it's so interesting that at this point, there has been so much lore already to get here. But you're seeing how Horus, even when things don't go exactly to plan, how he adapts and still is able to pull off this amazing trap against the loyalists that basically annihilates three loyalist legions. And you see just how utterly wrong-footed the loyalists are and just have no idea what to do, and how what Magnus did, because we talk about Magnus did nothing wrong, but like, this idea of like, what could have happened if the Emperor hadn't been stuck on the Golden Throne? Like, what would he have done? And you just have these Primarchs that are just blinded by rage, making really stupid decisions, even though they're supposed to be like these paragons of, like warfare. And, Ferris just makes all these really bad tactical decisions that lead to him, literally losing his head.
All of us read the massacre a long time ago. I'm assuming it was one of the original stories that came out. It's kind of been there and done that setting in the heresy, and it was fun to actually kind of go back and reread and prepare for this, and kind of come back with a new set of what now that we have a lot of hindsight after the heresy is over, kind of like let's kind of get in there and look at what this battle really meant for it. So I think from the narrative meta kind of look really quick, we gotta get out of the way first that Games Workshop needed this to happen. Like it was a massacre that was always going to have to happen because it needed to put the traders in a good spot. And even in Massacre Book Two, the Black Books, it even mentions like, hey, hindsight is a great thing, and like so we can't judge Ferris on his actions from it.
I think for me, on the topic of Ferris, I think that it goes back to like a big theme of the heresy, and I think Ferris does what he does because he's angry, right? Fulgrim just slaps him in the face and kills a bunch of his sons, and he is pissed, right? He does not think clearly. He is driven so hard by his anger that he does tactical blunder after tactical blunder in the hopes of killing Fulgrim. Now that said, I think Fulgrim is sorry. Ferris under the impression that he has seven loyalist legions versus Horus's four. So I think I'll give him that, where at least he knows reinforcements are coming. But that said, he still does a lot of dumb stuff because he's angry, and it goes back to the theme of the heresy, where a big thing of the whole novel series, where you have these superhuman demigods, but no matter how superhuman or how demigody they are, they're still humans and they make mistakes. They're driven by their emotions, like we all are. I think there's this beautiful conversation in, I think it's in the Death Part Two, between Sanguinius and the Emperor, where Sanguinius asks the Emperor why he made them emotional creatures, and the Emperor gives him this beautiful answer where, like, if you guys were robots, like, it won't work. Like, I need you to be a human with strengths and weaknesses, because it, it doesn't work. You can't do what you do unless you're like that. And I think Ferris falling to his human weakness is, I think, a very cool narrative moment, and goes back to the theme where even though they're superhuman demigods, they're still human. There's part of them that's human, and they'll make these mistakes.
To
So,
John's point, I
okay.
think one of the things that they do a really good job of early in the Horus Heresy, the book series, is showcase. I mean, yes, like a lot of the characters are not necessarily optimistic characters, but the optimism of the Imperium in general,
Yeah.
and how the Space Marines feel like they are creating this brighter future. And it's almost a joke to that, like they can't conceive early on that there's a possibility that Space Marines could turn on each other. Like it's
Mm-hmm.
so far removed from what they think is even possible that for
Sure.
them to
And let
imagine it,
alone
it
that Horus, the
literally
favored
like
son, did it.
breaks them. So
Yeah.
I think you do have to give a little bit of slack for it's like, for them to be like to fully accept what's happened is such a like, it's like being told that's they're literally their world, their universe turning upside down. It's being told that everything they
Absolutely.
thought they believed in is not true anymore.
Where Ferris is, I think, incorrect is that he assumes that they caught Horus before he was ready.
Yeah.
So Ferris thinks that when Fulgrim reveals the heresy to him, the idea that this is an impending event, Ferris thinks that he's caught them unprepared in this point where he can crush them quickly before they were ready. Horus is way more ready than anyone will really give him credit for. He literally has half the Imperium ready to follow him into damnation, along with half the Titans and the traitors, and his pact with the Dark Mechanicum at this point in time.
And I
I
think one
think
thing
that
we didn't
there's a lot.
mention, which is but pertinent to what you're saying here, like the Mechanicum had secretly been funneling the traitor legions the new armor. They'd been
Mhm.
funneling them bolters that were better at piercing ceramite. So like at Istvaan 5, the traitors had superior technology. Like they had weapons that were better equipped to killing other space marines than the loyalists did. Which was a huge, aspect in their favor. I mean, that's really what we're talking about. I think like obviously the betrayal happens no matter what. There is a chance that like Ferris might have survived if he had been a little bit more cautious.
Mhm.
And Vulcan as well might not have been because I don't know if we talked about this, but Vulcan basically gets captured and tortured by Conrad Kurz
Yeah.
for a
Yeah, but
long.
when he comes back to life.
So like Vulcan and Ferris might not have been taken out of the game so early if they had been
Yeah.
a bit more cautious. And yeah, sure, they probably still would have had their legions decimated, but they might have been able to escape.
Isfon 5 though is like one of my favorite battles for Horus Heresy, and I think it rightly so for me because I'm such a big Salamander player. It's really the only time we get to see them as a singular fighting force. I find myself bitter at it though at the end of it, where I'm looking at that 98% stat, and I'm like, I think that's Ferris's fault. Like, definitely,
Oh, totally.
there's room
Yeah.
in there for Vulcan to be like, all right, let's just we're going to take as many as we can down with us. But at that point in time, there's not much that could have been done. Um, and I really enjoyed us just going back and rereading this one because it was cool, getting to see kind of what inspired a lot of my initial love for Heresy.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
also want to point out, going back to, Horus Heresy began as paragraph snippets in, first, second edition Warhammer books, right? And as far as we know, Istvan 5 was just, here's, Horus is dug in, the three loyalists come in, they get trapped in the middle, and then they all die. Like that's what we have to work with, right? And you got to build this cool narrative around it. So there's definitely some weird stuff going on. Same for I think for Prospero, like Space Wolves just killed 1,000 suns for no reason. You gotta like paint Lehman Russ in a way where he's not this insane madman, but he does insane madman things, right? So it's interesting seeing like Reed said, looking back into reading back the lore and seeing how they attempt, I think successfully, to add depth to this kind of very silly 80s 90s action sequence that goes on in a
Yeah,
paragraph,
I
right?
mean, I think it's cool because like Instagram 5 is almost a little bit of a microcosm of the heresy at large, which is like I feel like you could basically sum up the heresy as essentially a loss of hope.
Hmm.
You have this bright, shining ideal of a potential future in which mankind is like prosperous and the dominant force in the galaxy, and it gets snuffed out by betrayal. And
Yeah.
that's
yeah,
what's happening. Even like here, there's this idea that like we're gonna win the day. We've got seven legions against four. We're gonna come in, we're gonna snuff out this heresy, and we're gonna keep on. Like we're gonna fix things. And then it's like very quickly turned on its head, and it's like, oh, we've lost all hope here. We're fucked.
yeah,
And that's just a theme that you see a lot in the heresy of like, oh, if only, right? If only things could have been a little bit different. If only this had happened instead of that. And that's kind of the sad, I mean, that's part of I think what
Yeah.
draws people to the heresy is like there's this, melancholy to it that is a reflection of the real world in a lot of ways where you see what's happened in the past because this is in a lot of ways it's like a historical lore game, right? Like you're looking at like something that happened in the past almost, and you're like, if only we could have done this differently. We could have made things better. And that's what I think is really powerful about it. Is like you see this and you get frustrated by it and you want to change it, but like the fact that you can't change it is what makes it so powerful.
Hmm.
yeah. I don't remember where I think I've seen it, but a lot of the time the Imperium is described as this kind of work of art, this almost kind of mural. And I thought it was actually kind of really poignant in the trailer, in the cinematic trailer that was shown off. The first thing that we see is Constantine Valdor and Jedediah Kroll looking at this painting that the Emperor has done. And it's kind of this magnificent piece that shows all the parts of what the glory of humanity could be. And I actually kind of wish they had gone back there and we had seen Valdor and Malcador back in front of it post the massacre and kind of being able to deliver those lines. Don't get me wrong, I love seeing the outside of the Imperial Palace. Love seeing that from the terrain perspective. But this idea that the betrayal on Isstvan 3 were cracks that had really appeared in the mural of the Imperium, but it was really on the the black sand of Isstvan 5 where it was shattered, and the idea that the almighty Imperium that kind of couldn't be defeated is now for the first time looking down the barrel of the Death of Hope, exactly like you said, Randy. There's this kind of real moment of this could be it, and the forces of evil might win.
Because again, as far
Um,
as they know, like three Loyalist Primarchs die there. You know,
Yeah.
yeah,
it's a
yeah,
while
that's
before they
almost
find out.
apocalyptic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah,
Especially
uh,
because a lot of people in the Imperium had been led to believe at this point that Primarchs couldn't die.
yeah,
Like the
yeah,
two that had been, the two legions that vanished had been covered up. Nobody knew, even though the loyalist Primarchs were left, didn't know what happened to them. They had their minds wiped. So like nobody knew that a Primarch could even die at this point. And then you lose three at once potentially.
yeah. I will say, I forgot to mention, the Loyalists also they get a small win here, where I think 90% of the Galvor back are killed in this Fun Five. Like Korax just like murks them, and then the Custodes escort also like slap them apart. But yeah, after this, there's no more OG Galvor back. I think. Well, Argotol's left, but he has to train the next generation of not as good possessed marines, where the OG guys are just kind of wiped out there. So good job, Korax.
yeah. I forgot about that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good point where you kind of see like one of these kind of new heresy era kind of things that obviously the word bearers haven't kind of perfected in a way.
yeah.
They were kind of this, even though they're the perfect original ones, they were kind of still not able to withstand the fury of the loyalists.
I mean, you got Korax bearing down on you. There's not much you can do about it.
And I just love that imagery of him fighting against Lorgar, standing over him with curs coming down with his little predator knives coming out of his hand,
Yeah.
just stopping Korax from cutting out Lorgar, and it's just this really kind of incredible scene and really kind of fraternal bond moment between curs, who then kind of turns around to Lorgar and is like, "You're disgusting."
Yeah.
And Largo's
It's
like, "Hey,
incredible,
F you guys, I won."
right?
Since that
Yeah.
that scene in I think it's Black Legion, where the Black Legion, or the traitors, they see the Black Templars and like, oh my gosh, dude, Lorgar like actually won.
Yeah.
Because they
Yeah.
see these religious fanatics in his, in his by his design. So, but anyways, people
And
hate the word bearers, but
if I'm
they
correct, though,
won.
I think there was also talk at this point in time that the between the Black Rider Library or the Black Library writers, they were trying to decide if Wolgar was going to die in Nolan's heresy. There was kind of talk about having him die at the massacre, and this was kind of decided not to happen in kind of the last minute. Just interesting, how things could have changed.
That's probably a good place to leave it off. Let us know what let us know what you guys think. Obviously there's a lot of lore here. There's a lot of really cool moments and characters. But yeah, we're very excited for the new edition. We're going to be playing out some of our own Isstvan 5 battles.
Yeah,
Maybe
Randy just finished
how
up
it works.
Ataris Warhound Titans, so I am begging him to let me take it with my salamanders, and we'll do some, rowdy, raunchy kind of goodness with all of that. And if anyone can comment and subscribe to us and mercilessly bully John, he has a Reaver Titan that needs to be finished in the colors of Legio Mortis, which would really, really help us for this
Oh
battle.
man, after my next Solar Ox project, maybe
Yeah, maybe fourth edition. We'll
maybe
we'll
fourth
come
edition.
back and still
Everybody,
ask
please
you if you
bully
can get
John
your
in the
reavers done.
Yes, yes,
And
please.
if you could help us. But thank
Cyberbully me in
you
real life to build my
thank you guys
Reaver.
for all joining and talking to us about this, because it's been a really fun thing going back and kind of revisiting the lore and getting to talk about it and share it with you guys.
Yeah, definitely. All right, everybody. We'll see you guys in the next one.
All right, thank you. Bye.